What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Catholic OCD podcast. Today I want to talk to you guys about predestination. Predestination, what exactly is the Catholic viewpoint of predestination, and how much does this differ from Calvinism? Is predestination just this Calvinistic belief, or does the Catholic Church actually teach predestination? What are the similarities of predestination between Catholicism and Calvinism, and what are the actual distinctions? Bear with me today as we try to cover this deep doctrine and this deep topic in a way that I hope is understandable to people like you and me.
You're a child of the storm, a child of the Lord. You live your life without getting bored. You lose your mind, but you find it again. And talking about grace and talking about sin. Death's in the world and it's gone viral. Everybody's talking about a new revival. But when it's a question of love and survival, bourbon, bluegrass, and the Bible.
So before we get started, if you guys haven't had a chance yet, if you can go ahead and like and subscribe to this channel, it helps to spread the message of this channel, and hopefully this channel helps to bring you closer to God. That's the goal of this whole YouTube channel. So if you like it, share it with your friends, and I hope that it's beneficial to you guys. Don't forget to always go ahead and leave your comments below. I enjoy reading your guys' thoughts. I enjoy learning from you guys, and I enjoy some of the great conversations that I get to not only participate in, but I also get to see on the comment section from these videos. So in order to understand the distinction between Catholicism and Calvinism, we first have to understand the distinction between St. Augustine and an English monk named Pelagius. So around the late 300s, early 400s, we have the great bishop St. Augustine, and then we had this British monk named Pelagius. And what ends up happening is Pelagius reads something that St. Augustine wrote, and he reads it, and it's something that really bothers him because he thinks that St. Augustine is attacking free will too much, and he thinks that St. Augustine is overemphasizing the necessity of grace and how much exactly God has to move in our life in order for us to be able to walk in this relationship with God. St. Augustine writes this: "Lord, give what you command, and then command what you will." Now, what does that mean? Augustine is saying that God commands all of us to walk in relationship with Him. God commands all of us to have faith in Him. God commands all of us to walk in a life that's worthy of the calling of God. Augustine recognizes this, and every Christian should recognize that God truly commands this from everybody. But while Augustine recognizes that God commands this from everybody, Augustine realized that man is utterly dependent on the grace and movement of God in the heart of the human being in order for the human to be able to enter into relationship with God. In order for humanity to be able to walk in faith and to walk and keep the commandments of God, humans are utterly dependent on God willing this ability inside the human. So Augustine is saying that in order for us to be able to do, Lord, what you command, you have to will that we are able to do this. You have to will this. When Pelagius reads this, in his mind, he's thinking to himself, well, what are you saying? Are you saying that, like, God actually is just working through us and that humans can't just choose God. And many Catholics that you talk to, they have this idea that Calvinism teaches that nobody can follow God by their own power, and that nobody can believe in God unless God actually gives you a gift of faith. And Calvinists don't believe that humans by their own free will can actually believe in God and receive this free gift of grace from God. But the issue is, that is what Calvinism believes, but that's also what Catholicism believes. In Catholicism, when Catholicism looks at the arguments between St. Augustine, who is emphasizing the necessity of God to will our relationship with him into being, when Augustine recognizes this and Pelagius emphasizes this ability of free will without needing this grace to move our wills, Catholicism recognizes that Augustine is right in that Pelagius was a heretic. And at the Council of Orange, the Catholic Church sides with Augustine and condemns the viewpoints of Pelagius. So when we understand what Pelagius is trying to say here, that he thinks that humans can just by their own free will turn and choose God and walk with God, and that we don't need God to move into our hearts and give us the ability to actually believe in God, because Pelagius believes that you're born with the ability to either choose God or to not choose God. And the fact of the matter is, in this topic, Catholicism is way closer to Calvinism than people think, in that Catholicism and Calvinism are really going to find a lot of agreement when it comes to agreeing with Augustine and condemning the viewpoints of Pelagius. I want to read from you guys here from the Council of Trent, which is obviously in the 16th century. The Council of Trent on the canons, when it comes to the topic of justification, the Catholic Church says this. Canon number 1. If anyone saith that man may be justified before God by his own works, whether done through the teaching of human nature or that of the law, without the grace of God through Jesus Christ, let him be anathema. So right here, Catholicism is condemning the idea that man can live by his own free ability and his own natural power. The idea that man can live this life that is so pleasing to God that it will justify God. Catholicism recognizes that that is a works-based righteousness that is understood through the lens of the natural ability of man to please God in a way that justifies him. And Catholicism recognizes that that is a heresy and that is contrary to the gospel. The Calvinist is going to agree with the Catholic there and say, yes, that works-based righteousness based on your own natural ability is a heresy. Canon 2. If anyone saith that the grace of God through Jesus Christ is given only for this, that man may be able more easily to live justly and to merit eternal life, as if by free will without grace he were able to do both, though hardly indeed and with difficulty, let him be anathema. This is known as semi-Pelagianism, which is the idea that, yes, man can technically by their own free will live this life that's pleasing to God and that makes them deserve justification and merit justification. But it's really, really, really difficult. I mean, it's almost impossible. So therefore, God grants grace, and grace is like a crutch, and it helps you on this journey. So grace can help you merit this works righteousness justification, because without grace, it would be really, really hard, not impossible, but hard to merit your salvation. Again here, Catholicism is going to view this as semi-Pelagianism, even believing that grace is given as like a helper, Catholicism is going to recognize that this is heresy. And the Calvinist is going to agree with us here too. Canon 3, if anyone saith that without the prevenient inspiration of the Holy Ghost and without his help, man can believe, hope, love, or be penitent as he ought, so as that the grace of justification may be bestowed upon him, let him be anathema. So again here, Catholicism is saying you can't even believe that you would choose God unless God were to act in your life. You must have prevenient grace. The Holy Spirit has to actually act in your life before you can actually turn to God, believe in God, love God, or follow God at all. You are utterly dependent on the grace of God to actually enter into this relationship with God. And this is what Augustine is saying, that God demands that we walk and that we live in this life of repentance, and God demands that we love him. God demands that we have faith in him. But Trent is agreeing with Augustine here, saying, yeah, but you can't actually do that unless God wills to actually engage you with the grace of the Holy Spirit to actually turn you towards him. So this point, the Catholic and the Calvinist, even going through these 3 canons that we read from the Council of Trent, are actually going to be on the same side. And both of their viewpoints here are going to be very Augustinian and very anti-Pelagian. So what the Catholicism does not teach Pelagianism, although if you go talk to the average Catholic, they're probably going to be Pelagian. So like even with this channel, the purpose of this channel isn't just to teach Protestants a deeper truth of Catholicism, but part of this channel is to teach Catholics the actual Catholic gospel and Catholic doctrines. So now, where in these first 3 canons, we could see that we're really close with each other. The Catholic and the Calvinist are actually having a lot of stuff in common. We're going to see a distinction here when it comes to the 4th canon. When you look at the idea of how some people use analogies to describe predestination in Catholicism, you're going to see this idea of going through John chapter 6 and saying how when Jesus says, no one can come to me unless God draws him. So we both understand, the Catholic and the Calvinist understand that in order to turn towards God, in order to believe in God, we are dependent on God moving first. We are dependent on God offering us grace. But sometimes if you hear a Calvinist, even like the great R.C. Sproul, talk about John 6 when Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him, he's going to use this idea, well, listen, that word draw is the same way like when you draw a bucket of water from a well. Like when you go to draw that water, that bucket doesn't cooperate, it doesn't have a choice. And so when God draws man, it's not necessarily that man has this choice or man is cooperating. It's no, God draws man to himself in the same way that man draws a bucket of water towards himself. And this analogy that R.C. Sproul will use, using a bucket, which is something that does not have a soul, something that is an inanimate object, something that is lifeless, it's soulless. Using that analogy is going to be something that the Catholic Church is going to have an issue with. So if we look at canon number 4 here, it says, if anyone saith that man's free will moved and excited by God, by assenting to God, exciting and calling, no wise cooperates towards disposing and preparing itself for obtaining the grace of justification, that it cannot refuse its consent if it would, but that as something inanimate it does nothing whatever and is merely passive, let him be anathema. How can Catholics claim that man has free will and yet claim at the same time the necessity of being drawn towards God and the necessity of grace? In this video, I'm trying to cover this big topic, and I'm going to try to teach the viewpoint of, in Catholicism, what's known as Thomism. In Catholicism, there's not one specific viewpoint of predestination. There are points and topics and beliefs of predestination that are off limits and that are rejected by the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church allows a certain amount of freedom when it comes to predestination in the church. And I'm going to emphasize today on one viewpoint, which is known as Thomism, which is the understanding of predestination from the line of thought coming from St. Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century, and his understanding of Augustine's viewpoint of predestination and how he understood it in light of St. Paul's teaching of predestination. There are some people who are probably watching this channel because I found out that there are some people who are actually some pretty deep theologians that watch this channel, and they're probably, some of them I can imagine are probably like, Nick, I don't know if you're qualified to cover this topic, and I can understand them being a little bit nervous of me jumping into the deep to this deep theology and deep topic of predestination right now. One of the challenges that we have is emphasizing the Catholic viewpoint of maintaining the doctrine of free will, while at the same time showing the necessity of predestination, the necessity of God's efficacious calling in our lives. Let's make a distinction here. What Catholicism, what Aquinas is really going to teach is that the way that grace works is grace really elevates the human nature. And this could be understood in Calvinism too. And even in things that R.C. Sproul has written, if you've ever read Chosen by God by R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul was actually a huge fan of Thomas Aquinas. What's interesting is the famous Calvinist R.C. Sproul had a series before, and it was called the Top 10 Heroes of Christianity. And he had the Roman Catholic Thomas Aquinas as number 4, as the 4th greatest hero in Christianity. He believed that Thomas Aquinas was a Calvinist. And where there are a ton of similarities from Calvin, who came 300 years after Thomas Aquinas, there are some differences. I think that some of the issues that goes on with Calvinists and even modern Calvinists is sometimes they teach teachings of Calvinism that seem like they contradict each other. So example would be like R.C. Sproul using the idea of drawing as in drawing a bucket. A bucket has no life, it has no soul. Another verse that oftentimes you'll hear people use is when St. Paul talks about how we were dead in our transgressions. And a Calvinist is going to say, listen, dead people don't cooperate. A dead corpse doesn't cooperate. It doesn't respond to God's grace. It's just dead. Therefore, God does everything. And they're going to sometimes use these viewpoints of inanimate objects to almost make it look like predestination and salvation is nothing more than God just playing a game of chess with himself, or God just playing this board game with himself where he just moves inanimate object people like he's moving pawns or he's moving pieces on a board game. And sometimes modern Calvinists can make it seem like, you know, this is just the way of the Frenchman John Calvin understanding predestination.
I think it's gonna work. No?
Jean Calvin.
Now, while it's sometimes the Calvinists can speak out of one end of their mouth and make it look like salvation is just God moving inanimate objects, there are other times where Calvinists can describe predestination not corrupting free will in a way that I think that the Catholic can understand it and agree with it. Let me give you one example. Let's say that you had a blindfold on. So if you're watching this video right now, close your eyes, okay? So if your eyes are closed and I told you there are two paths that you could go on, and you reach out with your right hand to the right path, and when you reach down that right path, you feel something soft, it's warm, it feels good on your hands. And I tell you, that's a pathway. But I tell you, reach out your left hand. If you reach out your left hand, immediately something stabs your hand. Immediately you could feel a prick in your finger, and you could tell that there's a little bit of blood that's being drawn. Now, based on your free will, if I were to ask you which pathway do you want to go down, everybody's going to choose the pathway on the right, where it felt warm and it felt soft. But all of a sudden, what happens if I took the blindfold off of you? You were blindfolded when you were doing this feeling from your left to your right. But I took the blindfold off. And let's say now, if you open up your eyes, let's say now, when you look down this path that was to your right, where it was all, you know, squishy and warm, you realize this was just one big pasture of cow crap. And then all of a sudden, if you look to your left where your finger was pricked, it was because you touched one of the beautiful roses from the rose garden that is along this path that leads to this beautiful mansion. Now that you can see more clear, which path are you going to go down? Who's going to choose the pathway down the cow crap, and who is going to choose the pathway down by the rose garden that goes to the big mansion? All of a sudden now, you're going to see people start to choose going towards the mansion down through the rose path. But is that based on their free will? Well, yeah, it's based on their free will. But what about the first choice? When they wanted to choose down towards the right, towards the cow crap, was that based on their free will? Yes, that was based on their free will also. So what happened then? What happened is that they actually had to be enlightened. They actually had to be unblindfolded. And this is what the Catholic will call prevenient grace. It's this prevenient grace that's going to make us be able to have our heart tugged and to realize, to understand that maybe God is the greater good. And, you know, maybe this world doesn't have what I think that it has to offer, and maybe I need to choose God. Every person is dependent on being unblindfolded before they can choose God, before they can cooperate with God's grace. And Pelagius, his whole viewpoint was he believed that men were just born without a blindfold, that man was born with the ability to see that this was a cow pasture and that was a rose garden leading up to a mansion. And Augustine is saying, no, we are all born blindfolded. We are all born in slavery and blindfolded because of Adam and Eve and because of the fall of man. So therefore, because man's nature is so fallen, none of us would ever want or desire to go down this pathway of the rose garden to the mansion. None of us, by our own natural ability, are ever going to desire to go towards God. We all, by our natural ability, would be fooled in thinking that the soft, warm cow pasture is the right way to go. So when people sin, they are sinning freely based on their free will. And both the Catholic and the Calvinists are going to reject the idea of hyper-Calvinism, which is this idea that God actually infuses sinfulness inside of you, or that God's actually moving you in this positive way to actually sin. These people who go down the pathway to destruction, the cow pasture way, they do so by their free will. So free will, if God were to never unblindfold us, if God were to never offer us grace, this what we call freedom would just be something that actually traps us even more into our sin.
Oh, I'm free, I'm free. Oh. Dang it.
So now, when we get to the idea of the blindfolding and the being and having God by grace lift up the blindfold to give us ears to hear and eyes to see, this brings up a topic of Calvinism, and it's the idea of irresistible grace. Now, before we condemn totally irresistible grace, let's say what is true from grace. And what is true from grace is that God does not ask you if he can unblindfold you. In that aspect, that grace for God to actually touch you with grace, that's irresistible. He doesn't ask for your permission to touch you with grace before he touches you with grace. If he did, no one would ever say yes. In order for us to be able to say, yes, God, I want your grace, that would already mean that grace was activated in us. So in this aspect, understanding that Calvinists, that 5-point Calvinists today, do teach irresistible grace, we have to understand that when it comes to prevenient grace that Catholics believe in, that the first contact that is between you and God is God calls you, not you calling God. We do have to understand that first calling of God is irresistible. So even in this aspect, we can understand, okay, Calvinism and Thomism don't seem that far apart yet. And even a Calvinist can come out and say, like, listen, Nick, even that whole idea of the inanimate object, no, I believe that God does, he does, like you the analogy with the two, with the cow pasture or the pathway of the rose garden going to the mansion. Nick, I do believe, I see what you're saying there. Yes, God enlightens us, and then it's our free will that's now enlightened by God. So therefore, Calvinism does not necessarily have to reject free will the same way that the Catholic who believes in predestination and prevenient grace doesn't have to reject free will either. So what we see so far that the Calvinists and Aquinas are closer than we think, what is actually like the differences? I remember years ago I called into Catholic Answers, and there was a guy there in the morning, and I asked him this question. I was like, listen, I'm having a hard time figuring out, like, what is the difference between Aquinas' viewpoint of predestination versus the viewpoint of Calvin? And I remember they were like, I mean, do you get an easier question? I was like, no, I really want to figure this out. This is what I've got so far. This is what I think the actual differences are. So the first thing we have to understand is I want to take down Calvinism, and I want you to know two types of grace in Calvinism. What's known as common grace and what's known as persevering, regenerating, saving grace. Those are the two types of grace that you have to know about in Calvinism. In Thomism, there's three types of grace. that I want you to know about. One is called sufficient grace. The other one is called efficacious grace. And the third one is called sustaining grace. So, there are two main differences that I see between Calvinism and Thomism. One is the idea of limited atonement, and the other is the idea of the automatic perseverance of all of the regenerate. Might sound deep, but bear with me. So in Calvinism, there is this idea of perseverance of the saints. So if you know the acronym for the 5 points of Calvinism, TOLUP, total depravity, unconditional election, which I think Aquinas agrees with also, limited atonement, which I think would be a difference, irresistible grace, which if we're talking about prevenient grace, like, yeah, the Catholic can agree with that also. But then the P, which is the perseverance of the saints. Now, there is a difference between once saved, always saved, compared to perseverance of the saints. So Calvinism, when it teaches perseverance of the saints, don't assume that that means that it's teaching this easy believism, once saved, always saved. There is a difference. Some people who teach easy believism, once saved, always saved, what they're really teaching is that God opens up a blank Lamb's Book of Life. So it's like this, it's blank. At the foundation of the world, here's the Lamb's Book of Life, and it's blank. And what God does is he sits there with a pen, and he waits. And if at any moment in your life, for 1 second, if you truly believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he died for your sins, and that you are saved, if you believe that for 1 second, immediately, as soon as you have that belief, your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, and it can never be erased. Now, you don't judge your salvation based on, am I living in Christ right now? You don't judge it do I even believe in Jesus right now? The easy believism, once saved, always saved, teaches you could die as a abortion doctor who lives in this in a lifestyle of orgies and is an atheist, and you can die and you will still be saved. Now, God might kill you, he might smite you from the earth because of your sinfulness, but you would still be saved, because when you get to heaven, God will see that on July 22nd, 1984, you believed, and therefore your name was written in permanent ink in the Lamb's Book of Life, and it can never be erased. That is the easy believism, once saved, always saved. Notice you can die outside of a relationship with Jesus and still be saved in that viewpoint. In reality, the Calvinists, just like the Catholic, are actually going to reject that. Calvinism is going to teach that you have to die in a living relationship with Christ to be saved. In their teaching of perseverance of the saints, what they're going to believe is whenever God makes you born again, when he regenerates your heart, which is the irresistible grace in Calvinism, you are born again before you have faith. In Calvinism, you don't become born again once you have faith. You have faith because you were born again, and you cannot reject the idea of being born again. That's the irresistible grace. And what they're going to teach is whoever God makes born again, it's irresistible, and he will also preserve you throughout your life. You will persevere in this relationship with Christ. You're never going to walk away from the relationship with Christ. They believe you could sin, you could fall into periods of sin, but you can never actually break your union with Christ if you're truly saved. So in that aspect of them believing, look, once you're saved, you're always going to be saved, it's through this viewpoint of God preserving you in your walk that's different than just once saved, always saved. So that idea of perseverance of the saints, if you're ever born again, if you ever have justifying faith, then you will always be in this relationship with Christ and you will always have justifying faith. That is something that's different from Thomism, because Thomism is going to teach that there are people who are born again, there are people who do have at a time justifying faith, and that they actually can fall away from it. The way that this breaks down is that Calvinism, again, believes in two types of faith. One is not saving. It's not a saving faith, and it's called common grace. And the other one is the saving grace that God offers you. Common grace, the Calvinists can believe can be offered to everybody, is basically, can God grant you a healthy life on this earth? Is it a grace if Bill Gates is a billionaire? Is that a gift from God? Like, could he say, hey, he's a healthy guy, he's a billionaire? It's a grace from God. The rain, grace, rains down on the just and the unjust. And there are very holy people who live very short lives, and there are very sinful people who are blessed with a long, healthy life, and even a happy life. But in Calvinism, common grace, which can be offered to everybody, if you don't die as a saved person, common grace actually really screws you in the end. Because picture if you're a billionaire like Bill Gates, and let's say you die as an atheist. Now you stand before God, and God's going to condemn you harder than he's going to condemn the poor, unhealthy man who died as an atheist. Common grace for the unsaved in Calvinism, it benefits you in this life, but then when you die, it actually stands and condemns you even more. So then for the Calvinists, you are dependent on this regenerate grace, this saving grace, and that saving grace is only given to the elect. In Calvinism, there is nobody who's ever brought into a union with Christ that is not of the elect. And so therefore, if you're united with Christ, you will always remain united with Christ. When it comes to the idea of the elect in Catholicism, in Thomism, where the Calvinist is going to say everybody who is elect will be born again and come into union with Christ, and everybody who is born again and comes into union with Christ is one of the elect. Thomism is not going to say that. Thomism is going to say that there is three types of grace that are offered. One is sufficient grace. God does truly offer a sufficient grace to everybody to be saved. Also, though, while God offers this sufficient grace to everybody, obviously this sufficient grace doesn't affect everybody. Not everybody comes into union with Christ. So therefore, those who come into union with Christ are said to have not only received sufficient grace, but they are said to receive efficacious grace. This means that they received a grace that actually affected them to the point where it brings them into union with Christ. Where Thomism is going to differ from Calvinism is Thomism is going to teach there are people who are born again, people who come into union with Christ, people who are like that seed, that third seed that was planted and it started to grow, it took root and it grew, but then it was choked off by the thorns, it was choked off by the pleasures and anxieties of this world, and it died. Thomism is going to teach that there are those people who receive not only sufficient grace, but they receive grace that affects them and brings them into union with Christ. And there are people who actually die, though, turned away, and they go back into their sinfulness and they walk out of the union with Christ. So therefore, Thomism says in order for you to go to heaven, not only do you need sufficient grace, and not only do you have to have be given efficacious grace, grace that actually affects you, but you have to be given sustaining grace, grace that actually makes you persevere towards the end. So in Calvinism, there's common grace that saves no one, and then there is the saving grace that makes you persevere to the end. In Thomism, there's sufficient grace that isn't just about you being wealthy, but it's actually a grace that's sufficient for you to actually respond and be saved. That's offered. And then there's efficacious grace, grace that actually not only is sufficient, but it affects you and brings you into union with Christ. And then there is sustaining grace that makes you persevere till the end. Hear what I'm about to say, because a lot of Catholics don't say what I'm about to say. Do I believe that the elect will lose their salvation? Is there anybody of the elect who will not go to heaven? And the answer is no. Both Aquinas and Calvin are going to differ from the easy believism person, because they're going to say that in the Lamb's Book of Life, the names are written down before the world was even made. Everybody who's going to go to heaven, your name is already written in the Lamb's Book of Life. You are one of the elect. If you're not in there, you're not going to be in there. And if your name's in the Lamb's Book of Life, it's never going to be taken out. The elect are those who will persevere till the end. They are the ones who will have sustaining grace. Calvinism emphasizes the idea that you know that you're one of the elect. And Thomism's not. Thomism, I don't know if I'm one of the elect. This is going to shock you. Like, I have a great hope, and I have trust in God that I am. And I have trust in God that He will keep me. And my hope is in God that He will sustain me. But to have this very prideful attitude of like, oh no, I know no matter what, Lord, they might all others betray you, but not me. No. And Aquinas would say, no, that is the sin of presumption. That's presuming that your name is in the Lamb's Book of Life. And the Council of Trent says, like, you can know that if God comes to you and reveals you supernaturally. He says, hey, Nick, good news. Your name's in the Lamb's Book of Life. I'd be like, sweet. But unless that happens, I have to be dependent on trust in God. So we trust that our name is in the Lamb's Book of Life. We trust that we are one of the elect, but we don't presume to know so. And this really, for a lot of people, they're like, that doesn't really make sense. See, but the whole idea with Thomism is it makes you dependent on this relationship with Christ. I can't just ever get to a point where, well, my name's in there, so I'm going to walk away, God, for a little bit. I'm going to break the union just for a little bit, but then I'll be back. No, we have to maintain in the relationship. And so we're not going to ever give that assurance to anybody that, hey, you are in the elect. And this really makes sense when Peter says, make every effort to make your election sure. Like, what's that mean? How can we make our election sure? And what Peter's saying is something that Catholicism would just teach. You have your hope and your trust in your election, but continually cooperate with God's grace and live in a relationship with Him. So when you see this difference between everybody who's born again is the elect and justified in Calvinism, and everybody who is elect will be born again and have justifying faith. This is the Calvinistic viewpoint. Thomism's viewpoint of predestination and the elect is going to say there are those who are elect, and they will not only have sufficient grace, but it's going to affect them. It's going to be efficacious grace, and it's actually going to sustain. That is sustaining grace. But there are people who can come into union with Christ, be born again, have justifying faith, and not end up in heaven. But both Thomism and Calvinism are going to believe that the elect are never going to lose their salvation. They're never not going to go to heaven. And that is held by Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin. And for some of you, that might be a little bit more Calvinistic than you think, but mind you, Aquinas is 300 years before Calvin. So this idea of Thomism having that understanding of the people who can be saved and come into union with Christ and walk away from it, and Calvinism not having that, that is one of the differences. The other difference then is going to be with limited atonement. And I think that this is really where the two traditions part ways. If you're a 5-point Calvinist, which not every Calvinist is a 5-point Calvinist, but a 5-point Calvinist believes in the L, limited atonement. Now, can a Catholic believe in any sense of the atonement being limited? Well, yes. If we mean that Jesus willfully died for everyone, and he shed blood for everyone to cover the sins of everybody, and that he actually is going to call everybody, and he actually wants everybody, and he's going to grant them grace that's sufficient for everybody, we would understand that while his death atones for everybody, that atonement is not efficacious to everybody. There are many people who are going to die, and they will have never been in a state of peace with God. They never entered a point where the blood of Christ covered them from the wrath of God, okay? Both the Catholic and the Calvinist should understand this. So the atonement, the effectiveness of the atonement is limited to those people who are going to have efficacious grace. But for the 5-point Calvinists, and sometimes they try to soften it up, I don't think that that's really what they believe. The idea is that Jesus only died for the elect. His intentions were only for the elect. For people who are not of the elect, there wasn't one wasted drop of blood for them. He didn't die and shed his blood for anybody who would not be saved. He doesn't have the intention of dying for them, nor is he actually going to call them, nor is he going to grant them any sort of saving sufficient grace. His atonement in Calvinism is going to be limited and only intended for the elect who will go to heaven. And in Catholicism, we're going to say, no, that's not true. Jesus died for everybody, and his death offers sufficient grace to everybody. This seems to really back up St. Paul in Romans when he talks about how through one man's disobedience, talking about Adam, death entered into the world. Like how much more so through one man's obedience, talking about Christ, can we have grace offered to the whole world? So it seems like the Calvinist to me is saying Adam's death or Adam's sin truly brought damnation and corruption to everybody. But Jesus' atonement is only even offered or intended for a select few. And in Catholicism, we're going to say no. The grace, the atonement is for everybody, and this sufficient grace is offered to everybody. Everybody is offered grace to the point where they could be saved. If God offered sufficient grace to everybody in the world, and that was it, grace that was sufficient, they could be saved, nobody would be saved. That's actually what Thomism teaches. That's actually what I believe as of now. Nobody would be saved. So God goes that step for everybody. For those who grace actually affects them, it's not because God made a step. He went that step. He went that mile for you. It's because God went that extra mile. He went that extra mile for some people, and to where he grants them grace that truly is going to be efficacious. Not that it might be efficacious, but it will be efficacious. And if you then die and you go to heaven, it's because God not only did he go the extra mile, but he went above and beyond that, and he actually grants you sustaining grace. But the understanding, though, that differs us from Calvinism is we are going to believe that God goes that mile for everybody. He's calling everybody. Jesus died for everybody. This Calvinism wanting to hold on to limited atonement, I think, is really what breaks them apart from the Catholic viewpoint of predestination and from Thomism.
Don't, Elsa. Elsa. Your other hand, honey, I can't hold you.
I can reach it. I can reach it.
Elsa, give me your hand. Give me your other hand.
I know this was a deeper video, and I know it was a little bit longer. If you find one that's more understandable to the common people like you and me, let me know. Send it to me. It's hard to find videos distinguishing the similarities and the common ground between, or the similarities and the distinctions between Calvinism and Thomism. Where the distinctions are with the idea of Thomism, believing that you can be saved and you can enter into union with Christ and walk away from it, and the idea of you not knowing that you're one of the elect, but you just having this trust in God, and that Jesus did die for everybody and calls everybody. I do find it to be more biblical, and I do find it to be more patristical, especially in like the apostolic fathers. I don't think any of them like really presumed that they would be saved. And that's the evidence you have to find in the church fathers. Not the idea that the elect won't lose their salvation. Catholics, like, I don't believe the elect can lose their salvation. You have to, in order to prove Calvinism, you have to find in the church fathers those who said, I am one of the saved and I will never lose my salvation. That's what you have to find. For some of you guys who aren't that deep into theology, hopefully this was somewhat understandable to you guys. For some of you guys who are really deep in theology, if you have any critiques of what I said, you think I'm wrong about something, put it in the comments. I'm not going to presume that I'm correct on any of this stuff.
Well, I guess I'm a little out of my league here.
But I want to end with this. From an idea of giving you hope and encouragement through all this, which sounds really deep, this is all I want to tell you. Whether you're a Calvinist, whether you're a Catholic, when you want to have hope in your salvation, what you just got to know about salvation is this. You have to know that your salvation is based on you just responding to God's grace. So respond to God's grace. That's what you have to do. Like, not just what you have to know. What do you have to do? You have to respond to God's grace. And you have to understand that without grace, you'll never go to heaven. So you have to respond to God's grace, but also just understand that in order to respond to God's grace, you already have had to have been given grace. And recognize that if you're responding to God's grace, that's a result already of grace. I hope you guys like this. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you guys next time. Peace out.